I'm Ray Morrison, 67, and the HOA fined me $1.250 for playing taps at sunset. They called it an unauthorized auditory event. That's what the letter said, stamped, sealed, and hand-delivered like I was a criminal. All I had done was stand on my porch, raise my old brass bugle, and play 24 notes for fallen friends who never made it back. I'd done it quietly, respectfully, and at the same time every evening. But to Karen, the self-appointed preservationist of peace on the HOA board, it was apparently a disruptive ritual. She told me at the last HOA meeting in front of my neighbors in the board, this neighborhood deserves tranquility, not war propaganda. I looked her in the eye, said nothing, and walked out. But inside I was boiling. Not because of the fine, not even because of the insult, but because she said those words like they meant nothing, like they were just air. You don't forget the sound of taps when you've stood graveside in dress blues, saluting the folded flag handed to a weeping mother. You don't unhear silence that follows those final notes. And you sure as hell don't stop playing them because some pearl necklace tyrant thinks it clashes with her wine hour. But that day, as the sun dipped low and I cradled my trumpet in silence for the first time in years, I felt something shift. A line had been crossed. They had taken something sacred and tried to shrink it down into a line item violation. And in that moment, I decided something else. Karen had no idea who she was messing with. I had something she didn't patience. But before I tell you what happened on that day, let me explain how it all began. Before all this, I was just another quiet neighbor with a well-mowed lawn and a porch swing that creaked in rhythm with the wind. I bought the house 8 years ago after retiring from the Army. 22 years of service, most of them overseas, and I came back with a bum knee, a bugle case, and a deep need for stillness. This neighborhood seemed like a blessing back then, manicured, modest, and tucked far enough away from downtown noise that even the cicadas sounded polite. I moved in during winter when the trees were bare and the houses all looked like quiet sentinels. My first spring, I planted rosemary along the back fence. That scent reminded me of base camp in Kandahar, strong grounding. The only routine I kept was my sunset ritual. At precisely 7:04 p.m. during daylight savings, a habit from years of synchronized watches, I'd walk out onto the porch with my old bugle and play taps. Soft, slow. It was never about performance. It was about remembrance. I didn't do it for attention. I did it because that's what you do when you carry the names of the fallen in your chest. And for years, no one said a word. In fact, a few neighbors nodded respectfully when they passed. Some would pause during their walks, hand over heart. One older couple, the Grant Sweet folks, once brought me a slice of lemon pound cake and said, "My brother was buried with taps. Thank you." So I kept doing it. Every evening, no matter the weather. I've played through cold rain, heavy heat, even once during a power outage when the whole block was dark and still. And not once did I get a complaint, not until she moved in. Karen arrived like a hurricane made of beige. Everything about her seemed pressed and pointed. Her speech, her posture, even her dog, some tiny anxious thing with a name like Percival. From day one, she walked the street with a clipboard. I remember the first time I saw her, squinting up at my gutter line like she was scanning for violations in the shingles. She didn't introduce herself. She corrected herself into every conversation like she was already president of something. Within a month, she was on the HOA board. Within 2, she was chair. And just like that, the wind shifted. At first, it was small, a sticky note left on my mailbox that read, "Consider quieter hobbies for evening hours." Then came the email from the HOA account citing multiple concerns about auditory disturbances during twilight. I emailed back asking for clarification and received a single sentence in return. "We are monitoring the situation." That phrase, I hadn't heard it since Afghanistan, and somehow it felt even creepier coming from a suburban committee than a forward operating base. But I didn't change. Why should I? I wasn't breaking any laws. No decibel limits were being crossed. I wasn't blasting rock music. I was playing a solemn military bugle call soft enough that you could still hear birdsong under it. The shift was subtle at first. Neighbors stopped waving as often. Some crossed the street before they reached my driveway. Karen had begun her whisper campaign. I knew the tactics. Divide, then isolate. It's what petty authoritarians always do, not with force, but with erosion. She didn't come at me head on. She wore me down sideways. Still, I kept playing. Not defiantly, not proudly, just steadily. That's how I was trained. You don't flinch. You don't stop unless ordered by someone who outranks you. And as far as I was concerned, Karen's little clipboard didn't come close. But she wasn't finished. She was just getting warmed up. It started with a knock on the door during dinner. I was halfway through reheating meatloaf when I opened it to find two HOA board members standing there, Margaret and Tom, both stiff as broomsticks and avoiding eye contact. Ray, Margaret said, holding up a yellow envelope like it was radioactive. We've had multiple complaints logged about your nightly performance. Tom added quickly, Karen thought it best we address this directly. Inside the envelope was a formal notice of violation section 4.3, excessive noise nuisance. They'd even timestamped the exact minute of each alleged infraction, always 7:04 p.m., sharp, consistent, predictable, the way a tribute should be. I calmly asked what decibel level was being exceeded. Margaret blinked. Tom shuffled. Neither had a number. I asked who had complained. We can't disclose that. I asked how they were measuring the sound. It's about perception, Margaret said, lips pursed. And perception matters here. That phrase right there told me everything. This wasn't about volume, it was about control. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. Karen called it a community discussion on neighborhood harmony. I sat in the back wearing my old Army service jacket. Not for theatrics, but because I needed the weight of it around my shoulders. Karen stood at the front like she was directing a courtroom drama. She had a PowerPoint presentation, I kid you not, with a title slide that read Disruptive Behaviors and Their Impact on HOA Unity. Slide 2 showed a chart of complaints. As you can see, she said, pointer stick in hand, there has been a 300% increase in noise grievances since Mr. Morrison began his nightly routine. I raised my hand. I've played taps for 7 years. Who filed these complaints? She smiled tight. That's not relevant to the data. Another hand went up, Mrs. Grant. We like hearing taps. It's respectful. Karen's nostrils flared. Some of us don't want to be reminded of war every night during dinner. That was the moment. The air in the room changed. No one gasped, but a silence fell so thick it felt like you could hear the blood moving behind your ears. I stood up. It's not about war, I said. It's about remembering people who gave more than their dinner time. Karen replied coldly. And it's about respecting the neighborhood's right to peace. She made a motion. The board passed it in a quiet vote. Mr. Morrison is to cease playing instruments outdoors between the hours of 6 and 9 p.m. effective immediately. I walked out before the meeting ended. Not because I was ashamed, but because I couldn't trust myself to speak again without the weight of anger. And the worst part? The applause I didn't hear. Not a single neighbor clapped for her, but they didn't clap for me either. They just sat there, quiet, neutral. That kind of silence can be more violent than words. The next evening I stood on my porch, again trumpet in hand, unsure. I didn't play, but I held the bugle up to my lips and breathed through the mouthpiece without sound. Just a breath, like a ghost. The sun fell, the sky turned gold, and for the first time in nearly a decade, no notes broke the evening air. Karen had won the round. But she didn't understand the kind of man I was. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The first few days after the meeting felt like grief. Not anger, not yet. Just a hollow ache like something important had been taken without anyone noticing it mattered. I still went out onto the porch every evening at the same time. I still held the trumpet, but I didn't play. Not even a whisper. I watched the sunset in silence, alone. Then came the mocking. It started subtle. A kid on a skateboard rolled by and played a bugle sound effect on his phone. Karen's little bike barked every time it happened, like it had been trained to react. I ignored it. But the next morning I woke up to find a plastic toy trumpet jammed into my mailbox with a tag that read, "Use this instead. I don't know who did it, but I didn't need to." That kind of thing only happens when someone whispers enough poison in the right ears. Then the letters started showing up. Not official HOA ones, anonymous ones. Typewritten, signed, a concerned neighbor. The first one said, "We've all sacrificed things. Let it go." Another one read, "There are other ways to remember. Don't make it about you." That one hit me because I wasn't. It was never about me. That's what Karen didn't understand, or maybe refused to understand. TAPS isn't a performance, it's a promise. One I made standing in Arlington and in Kandahar, and in too many places where boys with soft eyes and strong hands never came home. But now I was being told to let it go. I stopped sleeping well. I'd lie in bed and hear phantom notes in my head like muscle memory trying to finish a sentence. Sometimes I'd get up and play in the garage with the door shut, the sound muffled, bouncing off garden tools and shelves of paint cans. But it wasn't the same. It felt like hiding. Then one morning while drinking coffee on the porch, Mrs. Grant walked over with something wrapped in a cloth. She opened it gently like she was unwrapping something sacred. Inside was a black and white photo of her brother in uniform, standing next to a bomber plane in World War II. The back was signed, "To Ellie, play it for me someday." She looked me in the eye and said, "You already are." I swallowed hard. That same afternoon, I received an email from the HOA. Another fine this time for public defiance of HOA directives, citing my continued threatening posture with the bugle, the threat holding an instrument in public view. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just about noise. Karen wanted obedience. She wanted quiet that she controlled a tidy, soft-spoken neighborhood where nothing hard or painful was ever acknowledged. Taps wasn't noise to her. It was defiance. Memory. And memory is messy. I sat at my dining room table that night and looked at the fines, the notes, the violation slips. I laid them out like intel on a mission briefing. This was war, not with bullets or barricades, but with language perception and fear. And I'd spent 2 decades learning how to handle that exact kind of battlefield. It was time to stop grieving and start planning. But before that, I needed something more than revenge. I needed the law on my side. There's a quiet rage that comes with being dismissed, not shouted down, not argued with, but silently brushed aside like your convictions are quaint. That's what Karen had done. Not just to me, but to what I stood for. She didn't just silence a trumpet. She tried to erase the meaning behind it. I wasn't interested in playing the martyr. I was interested in winning. I started with the county ordinances. I pored over decibel limits, curfew clauses, and zoning regulations. The documents were dry, but I treated them like intelligence reports. I highlighted, cross-referenced, and even visited the county clerk's office in person to get clarification on one vague section about sound events. Turns out the city had no specific restrictions against musical performances during the evening as long as they remained under 70 decibels at the property line and ended before 10 p.m. My porch readings, 57 decibels. I tested it myself using a decibel meter app and then verified it with a real meter I borrowed from the local library. But that wasn't enough. I didn't just want to clear my name. I wanted to protect the tradition. So I reached out to the local chapter of the American Legion, then to TAPS across America, then to a friend I hadn't spoken to in years, Staff Sergeant Wallace, who now worked in the mayor's office. "I remember your playing," Wallace said over the phone. "Always gave me chills. What's going on?" I told him everything. 2 days later, I got a call back from a local city councilman who was also a Gulf War vet. He'd heard about the HOA dispute. "Let me know if you want to make this public," he said. "You'll have support." That lit the fire. I began documenting everything. Every fine, every email, every complaint. I created a timeline and packaged it all in a tidy, easy-to-read format. Then I started collecting neighbor testimonials quietly, respectfully. I knocked on doors. Some people were hesitant. Others were relieved. One woman, a nurse named Leah, said, "I always open my kitchen window when you play. Reminds me to be grateful." Another neighbor, an older man I barely knew, teared up and told me his son never made it back from Fallujah. Karen had miscalculated. She assumed that because people were quiet, they agreed with her. What she didn't understand is that silence doesn't mean consent. Sometimes it just means people are waiting to see who's braver. And now it was time to act. I called a sound engineering company, explained my plan. I wanted a weatherproof, permanently mounted outdoor speaker system. Nothing garish, just professional. I told them I'd be using it to play exactly one piece of music once a day for 24 seconds. They were intrigued. I filed a permit with the city to install the system complete with specs and professional diagrams. I filled out the public sound exemption request for ceremonial audio, and I did it all by the book. No loopholes, no gray areas. Everything was above board. It took 2 weeks to get approved. 2 long silent weeks. The day the permit came through, I printed out a copy and slid it into a frame. Then I drove down to City Hall and picked up the brass plaque I'd commissioned in honor of the fallen. This community remembers. The installation only took a few hours. I stood back and looked at the discreet black box mounted under the eave of my porch, wires cleanly tucked away, amplifier sealed against the elements. To most people, it looked like a weather sensor, but it was much more than that. So, it was my voice. That evening at exactly 7:04 p.m., I stood on my porch in the full dress uniform. I didn't hold my bugle. I didn't even press play. The system was on a timer. And right as the sun touched the trees, the first notes of taps floated out across the neighborhood, soft, clear, and legal. The sound was gentle but impossible to ignore. I saw lights turn on, curtains pull back, and then something I hadn't expected. Doors opened, one by one. People stepped outside, not many at first, but enough. Mrs. Grant, Leah the nurse, the old man from down the street, a teenage boy and his father. Each of them stood quietly facing the sound, hand on heart or head bowed. Some held photos. Across the street, Karen appeared at her window, arms crossed, jaw tight. But she couldn't stop it. She couldn't find it, and she couldn't erase it. The next morning, I woke up to a new noise, the sharp clicking of Karen's heels on my driveway. I watched from the kitchen as she marched up to my porch like she owned it. Her mouth was already moving before I'd opened the screen door. This, she snapped, waving a folder like it was a sword, is a new violation. I didn't say anything. I just let her talk. You've installed an unauthorized audio system without HOA architectural approval. You've created a disturbance, a spectacle. It violates the community's aesthetic integrity. I held up the frame permit from the city and pointed to the small sign now posted near my front steps. Authorized sound installation permit, number 8472B, ceremonial exemption. It was drilled neatly into the base of the porch column, laminated and visible from the sidewalk. Karen's eyes flicked over it. She blinked. Then I handed her a second paper, a notarized letter from the city councilman, confirming that the system was compliant with all local codes and that any HOA restrictions attempting to override the permit would be considered harassment and subject to city oversight. She looked like she'd swallowed a lemon whole. You blindsided us, she muttered. I shrugged. I followed every rule. Karen turned heels, clicking furiously back down the walkway, her little dog barking from her front yard like it sensed her defeat. But that wasn't the end of it. Oh no. The next HOA meeting was packed. Word had spread fast. Not just about the speaker, but about the way Karen had handled things. People were tired, not just of her war on my trumpet, but of the endless pettiness, the lawn violations, the mailbox color mandates, the absurd ban on holiday wreaths larger than 18 inches. I sat in the front row this time. When Karen tried to skip public comments, the room erupted. I want to speak, Mrs. Grant said, voice shaking but clear. Leah the nurse stood too. Let him play. We like it. Others chimed in. Some recited memories of their own family members of quiet nights, listening to that soft song drifting through the air. One man said, I thought it was a recording all these years. I didn't know it was you, Ray. Thank you. Karen tried to reassert control, tapping her gavel like a frantic metronome. Order, please. This is not on the agenda. But the tide had turned, and then came the final blow, a motion from one of the newer board members to revise the community's audio policy to include exemptions for ceremonial sounds under city-approved permits. It passed 5-2. Karen voted no. Tom abstained. I didn't speak that night. I didn't need to. I walked home quietly as the sun dipped low. At 7:04, the speaker chimed again. Taps rang out across the lawns, and I stood in my yard watching silhouettes appear at doors and windows like clockwork. But something new happened that night. After the last note faded, a small ripple of applause broke the stillness. Not loud, not rowdy, just honest. The next morning, someone had left a fresh American flag on my porch. No note. Another neighbor brought me a potted rose bush with a tag that read, "For the ones who never came home." Even the kid with the bugle sound effect came by one afternoon and mumbled, "Sorry, sir," before biking off. Karen. She stopped walking past my house entirely. She filed one more complaint, a desperate, frantic document full of legal jargon and capital letters. The city dismissed it. Instead, they sent her a warning: harassment of a permitted ceremonial activity may result in investigation. It was over. And in her silence, I found mine again, not the kind forced on me, but the kind I'd chosen. I didn't need a war. I needed peace, and I had earned it. I didn't expect the story to spread. It started small, a photo someone took of my porch with the flagpole and the little bronze plaque. Then came the video. Just a 30-second clip a neighbor had filmed, catching the moment the speaker played taps as the sun dipped behind the trees. You could hear it echo softly down the cul-de-sac while silhouettes stood still in doorways. The video got picked up by a local Facebook group, then by a regional veterans page, then somehow by a national news station. 3 days later, a van rolled up with a local reporter, a camera crew, and a producer who asked if I'd be willing to share the story of how you honored the fallen and stood your ground. I hesitated. I'd never done it for attention. But if telling the truth meant reminding people why traditions like this mattered, then yes, I agreed. The segment aired that Friday night. Retired Army veterans silenced by HOA finds legal loophole to keep playing taps. They showed footage of the speaker, the frame permit, even a few snippets from the HOA meeting where neighbors had defended me. They blurred Karen's face, but not her quotes. The one about not wanting war propaganda during dinner was read out loud, followed by a long pause and the sound of taps fading into silence. The reaction immediate. Veteran groups flooded the HOA's email inbox with messages of support and questions. News outlets started digging into Karen's leadership record. A petition circulated calling for a review of the HOA's leadership practices. Over 5,000 signatures in the first 2 days. Karen tried to control the narrative. She called an emergency board meeting, but this time no one showed up. The board couldn't even form quorum. I wasn't watching gleefully from the sidelines. That wasn't my way. But I wasn't sorry either, because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about principle. It was about standing up in a quiet, dignified way when someone tried to reduce respect into a regulation. And now something else happened. People started asking me for advice. A woman from a neighboring town messaged me saying her HOA had tried to ban American flags over a certain size. A young Marine's widow sent a note thanking me for not letting the memory of sacrifice become a nuisance. I decided to take it one step further. I called Wallace, the staff sergeant in the mayor's office, and proposed something bigger. What if we helped people know their rights before they needed to fight? With his help, I created a small guidebook respecting traditions in residential communities. A veteran's guide to HOA compliance. I wrote it myself, short, straightforward, focused on the intersection of civic tradition and private regulation. We printed 50 copies. They disappeared in a week. Then came the emails from neighborhood associations asking for more. So I built a website. Nothing flashy, just a place where people could download the guide read stories like mine and submit their own. I called it Sound Honor. Karen's voice, once the loudest in the neighborhood, had gone eerily quiet. She stopped attending meetings. Someone told me she was taking a break for personal reasons. There was talk of a recall vote, but by then the power she held wasn't real anymore. It had cracked under the weight of her own arrogance. And my sound system's still running, still legal, still tuned to 7:04 p.m. But now more than just the music was happening. People started standing outside earlier, some with candles, some with folding chairs. One family placed a framed photo of their grandfather on their porch railing every evening. A ritual had grown, organic, honest, larger than me, and I hadn't even begun my final move. The day of the ceremony started quiet just like any other. I'd sent out a modest email blast to the neighbors. Nothing dramatic, just a simple invite. Please join me Friday evening at 7 p.m. to honor those we've lost and what we've reclaimed. I didn't expect a crowd, maybe a dozen folks, maybe just Mrs. Grant and the boy with the Bugle app. By 6:30, I was ironing my dress jacket when I noticed the noise outside, cars pulling in soft murmurs of conversation, folding chairs being set up on front lawns. I stepped out and paused. There were nearly 40 people gathered, all ages, some in uniform, a couple little kids holding miniature flags. A woman walked up carrying a photo album, clutching it like it was made of glass. I asked her whom she was remembering. My son, she said. First Cav. Baghdad. He used to play trumpet in high school too. She held up the album. The page showed a grinning young man in fatigues, one arm around a buddy and the other holding a battered brass horn. I took a long breath. At 7 p.m. sharp, I stepped onto my porch, stood beside the small bronze plaque and tapped the remote. The speaker came to life. Taps rang out clear and golden, floating across the crowd. No movement, no rustling, not even a baby fussed, just silence and sunset. When the final note faded, I spoke. Not loud, just enough for the front rows to hear. I didn't plan on becoming a symbol. I just wanted to remember my friends. But you reminded me that memory isn't just personal, it's shared, and we defend it together. I turned pointed at the new addition beside the speaker system. A square of concrete had been poured earlier that week, forming a small platform around the plaque. And on that platform stood something new, a flagpole 20 feet high, the rope neatly clipped, and the halyard quiet in the breeze. At the base of the pole, set in fresh cement, was an inscription, "Let every sunset remember," dedicated to the fallen, erected by those who stood their ground. There was a soft, collective inhale from the crowd. Then slowly people began to applaud. Not a raucous cheer, Not a standing ovation. Just slow, grateful clapping, the kind that starts in the chest before it reaches the hands. And then, as if summoned by fate, a breeze picked up. The flag rose gently and unfurled, catching the last light of the evening. Karen was there. I hadn't seen her arrive, but as the applause faded, I caught her silhouette near the sidewalk, arms folded, face unreadable. She didn't speak, she didn't heckle. She just stood for a moment and then walked away, head down, heels, silent on the grass this time. And that was her reckoning. Not a courtroom, not a fine, but the quiet realization that the power she tried to wield had returned to the people it belonged to. She hadn't been removed, she'd been made irrelevant. That night, long after the crowd had thinned, I sat on my porch, still in uniform, trumpet, resting beside me. A little girl from down the street walked up with a red, white, and blue drawing in her hand. Crayon stars a stick figure playing a bugle and the words, "Thank you for the music." I smiled and asked her name. "Maggie," she said. "I like the song. My daddy says it makes the sky feel bigger." I nodded, eyes stinging. "It does, Maggie. It really does." The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It trickled in like a slow, steady unraveling of everything Karen had tried to hold together. The following week, the HOA board released a formal statement. It was tepid and overly polished, but buried inside the bureaucratic language was a line that changed everything. The board acknowledges prior missteps in balancing community preferences with individual rights to expression and memorial observance. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was close enough for them. For me, it was a quiet, written admission that I had been right. Karen, on the other hand, didn't go down gracefully. She attempted one last maneuver. A new motion submitted through email demanding that non-visual installations altering the historic aesthetic of front-facing homes be put to a full vote, retroactively reviewed, and subject to removal. Only one board member responded. The reply was one sentence: "This motion is declined under city law and existing board policy." That response went public. Someone on the board, maybe Tom, maybe Margaret, leaked it to the neighborhood email list, along with a copy of the city permit and a detailed timeline of Karen's complaints, fines, and actions. The message included a quote from the HOA charter itself: "No rule may supersede city or state-granted rights, including those of ceremonial observance." The message ended with a vote of no confidence. Karen resigned 3 days later. No speech, no dramatic farewell, just a curt message that read, "I regret the energy spent on matters that should have brought us together." It was the most diplomatic version of surrender I'd ever read. For a while after she left, I noticed a strange calm settling over the neighborhood. People were friendlier, not just to me, but to each other. I saw porch lights strung up without fear of citation. A couple built a raised garden bed that previously would have sparked an architectural review. Someone even painted their front door red, and nobody blinked. It was like the air had loosened its grip. As for me, I kept things simple. Still played taps. Still at 7:04. Only now I didn't just do it on my porch. I started getting invited elsewhere. A school reached out, would I come talk about the history of taps? I brought my bugle and played for their Veterans Day assembly. They gave me a paper medal and a lot of hugs. A retirement home asked if I'd play in their courtyard one Sunday evening. I went, played soft and low. One of the old Marines saluted me and didn't drop his hand until the last note. Even the city took notice. That same councilman who helped me with the permits invited me to speak during a town hall on respect in public spaces. I wore the same dress uniform, gave a short speech about memory and sound and the power of restraint. I never once mentioned Karen by name. I didn't have to. Everyone knew. Her absence said more than her presence ever could. The HOA board, in its new form, passed a motion naming the sunset hour of 7:04 p.m. an optional moment of reflection. Not mandatory, not enforced, just offered. A suggestion to pause. And so the sound carried on. Each night the speaker did its job. The song played, the neighborhood stilled, people bowed their heads, and I sat with my bugle beside me, sometimes playing it live, sometimes letting the speaker do the work. Because this was never about the trumpet. It was about the silence between the notes. And who got to decide what filled it? I never expected peace to feel this quiet. Not empty, not hollow, but settled. Like the weight I'd carried for years had finally found a place to rest. There was a time when I thought I'd have to choose between memory and belonging, between honoring the past and being part of a community that seemed determined to forget it. Turns out, I didn't have to choose. I just had to stand long enough for the wind to change. The days moved differently now. Slower, softer. I started walking more, even without a destination. Neighbors waved more often. Some stopped to talk. A few apologized not with words exactly, but with gestures. A fresh pie, a respectful nod, a sudden willingness to listen. There was a depth to the quiet now, a kind of earned stillness. Because once a place has gone through something, once people have witnessed a reckoning and come out better for it, the silence that follows is not the absence of sound. It's the presence of grace. I found myself doing things I hadn't done in years. I pulled my bike out of the garage and oiled the chain. I started tending my rosemary bushes again. I taught a neighbor kid how to polish brass. He didn't even know what a bugle was until I let him hold it. "This is heavy," he said. "It's supposed to be," I told him. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. Not typed, handwritten. I opened it slowly, expecting more bureaucracy, more forms, more explanations. But it was from Karen. The envelope was plain. Inside, just a single folded sheet of paper. No return address, no signature, just 6 words. "I was wrong. Thank you anyway." I read it twice, then once more, just to make sure it was real. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled thinking about her, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with something like forgiveness. She had tried to bury something she didn't understand, but she had also, in some backwards way, helped it grow. The flag still flew from the new pole. I took good care of it. Every few weeks, I'd lower it, fold it tight, and replace it with a fresh one. The old ones I kept in a cedar chest by the front door. Each had flown over dozens of evenings filled with music, memory, and stillness. And as I stood on my porch one quiet Thursday evening, trumpet resting against the rail, sun dipping behind the trees, I heard a soft voice from across the street. A little girl, Maggie, the one who'd drawn me the crayon picture, was standing with her father, both of them holding small candles. She waved and said, "We're here." I nodded. The speaker clicked on, and once again 24 notes rang through the warm evening air. No conflict, no complaint, just a community that had learned to listen. A year later, we dedicated the memorial. It wasn't elaborate. No marble arches or towering monuments. Just a clean square patch of earth by the community park with a bench, a small landscape garden, and a polished bronze plaque that read, "In honor of the fallen and the families who remember. Sunset tribute begins at 7:04 p.m. All are welcome." We called it the Reflection Garden, and it became something bigger than I ever imagined. It started with that first dedication ceremony. Veterans from all across the county showed up. A color guard from the local ROTC marched the flag in. A young boy played Taps, Not Me. I stood beside him and let his shaky notes fill the space. That was the point. This wasn't mine anymore. Someone brought candles. Another brought small laminated photos of lost loved ones. One woman pinned her brother's Purple Heart to the tree at the garden center just for the evening. And Karen, she wasn't there. But I didn't need her to be, because by then the legacy had already taken root. People came every week. Not huge crowds, just a steady stream of quiet faces. Some brought folding chairs. Others simply stood and watched the flag ripple in the breeze. A father knelt next to his daughter and whispered something as the music played. A teenager stood awkwardly in the back, head bowed, hands stuffed in hoodie pockets. Even that meant something. The HOA now, with new leadership, fully adopted the garden as part of the neighborhood's identity. They included it in the community guidebook under shared amenities, reflection, garden, and tribute space. It was no longer a conflict. It was a feature. Some evenings I'd walk past and see a couple sitting on the bench just holding hands as the trumpet tones played through the speakers. Other nights I'd find a small wreath left by the plaque or a bundle of rosemary tied with ribbon, likely from my own bushes. I started hosting quarterly community nights. No speeches, no agenda, just a standing invitation. Show up, remember, be still. And every time I looked out over that garden, I saw something Karen never did. That memory doesn't need permission. That tradition doesn't go away just because it makes someone uncomfortable. And that honoring the past is never an inconvenience when you do it with respect. One evening, well after sunset, I stayed late at the garden. I'd forgotten my jacket and came back for it only to find someone already there. A young man I didn't recognize. Standing in front of the plaque, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly trembling. I didn't say anything. But as I turned to leave, he spoke without looking up. "My brother died in Syria last year. We didn't have a service, not really, but this feels like one." I nodded. That's what it's for. And I realized then this wasn't just the end of a conflict. It was the beginning of a legacy. One built not with volume or vengeance, but with quiet resolve, with structure, with presence, with patience. I went home that night and opened the cedar chest. Inside were 6 folded flags, each one flown above the garden since its creation. I added a note to the newest one for the ones who showed up, for the ones who stood still, and I placed it gently inside. Tomorrow would come as it always does, and at 7:04 p.m. taps would play again. Not because I fought for it, but because we all did. I never thought something so small, 24 notes at sunset, could change the entire fabric of a neighborhood. But it did. It started with resistance, with a challenge, with someone trying to smother something sacred under the weight of control and convenience. But the truth is, a memory has roots, deep ones. And when you try to pave over it, it doesn't disappear, it breaks through. I didn't want to fight. I wanted peace. The kind of peace you feel when the sky softens and the air goes still, and you really remember who gave you that quiet. There was a time when I felt invisible. Like my life, my habits, my history didn't fit into the polished blueprint of HOA living. But the funny thing is, once I stood my ground, others did too. And what started as a solo ritual became a shared rhythm. The speaker still chimes every evening at 7:04. Sometimes I play live, sometimes I don't. But it's never silent, because now we've built something that lives beyond the conflict, a garden, a ritual, a reminder that dignity can't be fined, that memory can't be regulated, and that even in the most ordinary places, something profound can take root. If you'd told me a year ago that this would all come from a single bugle call, I'd have laughed. But now, as I sit on my porch in the fading light, watching neighbors gather, strangers pause, and children learn how to be still, I understand something I didn't before. The fight was never about the noise. It was about who gets to define what matters. And sometimes the smallest sound, if played with purpose, is what echoes longest. It was a Wednesday morning when the notice arrived, folded neatly into my mailbox, printed on HOA letterhead, and sealed with the usual pomp. This one wasn't about noise or my speaker system. No, this one was different. This one said I was in violation for non-compliant landscaping, specifically for the rosemary bushes I had planted along the side of my house nearly 8 years ago. The same rosemary that had thrived through storms and droughts, that had grown into tall, fragrant hedges, buzzing with bees and memory. According to the letter, the bushes exceeded approved height limitations and disrupted visual harmony. I read the sentence twice, chuckled dryly, and tucked it into the same drawer where I kept all the other relics of HOA pettiness. But something about this one rubbed at me more than usual. It wasn't just the absurdity, it was the timing. The memorial garden had just passed its 1-year mark. The neighborhood had settled. Karen had moved out months ago, replaced by a quieter board that mostly left people alone. And yet here came this letter like a ghost tugging at the sleeve of peace. That afternoon, I walked the property line. The rosemary hedges were full and green, reaching just above waist height. Neatly trimmed, not wild, no weeds. I bent down and snapped a spur off, rubbed it between my fingers. The scent hit me like it always did, a grounding rush of earth and memory, of old barracks and field kitchens, and fire watch shifts that never seemed to end. These bushes weren't decorative. They were personal. They were planted for the friends who never got to come home, for the nights I couldn't sleep, for something to tend when there was nothing else to fix. I sent a polite email to the HOA board asking for clarification. 2 days later, a reply arrived from the new landscaping liaison, someone named Greg. I had seen him once or twice around the neighborhood, mid-30s, polo shirts with ironed collars, always talking fast. His message was robotic. Please be advised that according to Article 6.2.1 of the Community Guidelines, all front and side-facing hedges must remain below 30 inches in height and no more than 24 inches in width. Your plantings currently exceed both. I typed a reply, slow, careful, respectful. I explained the historical significance offered to trim them slightly and requested a variance. I even attached a copy of the community newsletter from last year, where the rosemary had been featured in an article titled, Veterans Garden, How One Neighbor Honors Memory Through Growth. Greg's response came 5 minutes later. Request denied. Noncompliance will result in fines. So I called a few neighbors, asked if they'd received similar notices. A few had, not for rosemary, but for sunflowers, native grasses, even one woman's butterfly garden. The pattern was familiar. New board member, new rules, same old control, dressed in fresh khakis. It would have been easy to pull the bushes, Replant smaller ones. Stay under the line. But something in me snapped. Not loudly, just firmly. These weren't weeds. They were markers. Living ones. And I wasn't going to dig them up to please someone who thought uniformity equaled beauty. Instead of fighting, I invited. That Sunday, I hosted a small gathering, called it Scent in Silence. I invited neighbors to come by, clip their own sprigs of rosemary, and share who they were remembering. I made tea, put out a folding table, played soft jazz from a speaker. I didn't say anything about the letter. One by one they came, some shy, others curious. Mrs. Grant brought cookies. Leah, the nurse, brought a tiny framed photo of her father in navy whites. A teenager came and stood awkwardly until I offered him a sprig and a smile. He didn't speak, just nodded and walked off with it. By the end of the afternoon, the hedges looked slightly thinner but still proud, and the conversation that filled the air felt like armor. I knew the fines would come, and they did. $50 a day for continuing landscape violation. I let them stack for a week before I responded, but I didn't send money, I sent a letter. In it, I wrote, "These plants are not decoration, they are memorial. Under Section 8.4 of the Municipal Code, properties with commemorative plantings for civic or religious purposes are eligible for case-by-case exemption. I am formally requesting this exemption. Please consider this my appeal." I copied the city's Urban Beautification Office, included a list of plants categorized as heritage flora, included photos of the rosemary in bloom beside folded flags. A week passed, then two. The fines stopped. No new notices arrived. Then came a call from someone I didn't expect, Greg. His voice was different this time, hesitant. "Mr. Morrison, we've reviewed your request, and I'd like to meet in person if that's all right." He came by that Friday, stood at the edge of the garden, said nothing for a long time. "My grandfather served in Korea," he finally said. "Used to grow rosemary too." Said it helped him think. I didn't say anything, just waited. "I didn't know," Greg said. "I just saw height numbers, not the meaning." He reached out, touched one of the branches lightly. "I'm recommending the board issue there a full variance. Permanent, and I'm sorry for not asking first." We shook hands, quietly. Later that month, a new addition was made to the community guidelines. Section 6.2.3, Memorial Plantings. The language was simple. Residents may maintain commemorative plantings that exceed standard dimensions, provided they are respectfully maintained and do not obstruct visibility or access. My rosemary bushes stayed. But more than that, a handful of others began planting their own. Lavender, milkweed, wild roses, tiny plots of remembrance began popping up across the neighborhood. Not uniform, not identical, but meaningful. I still trim the bushes every other Saturday, carefully, with slow hands and a full heart. And sometimes when the wind shifts, I catch the scent and remember that peace doesn't always come from silence. Sometimes it grows slowly, quietly, rooted in defiance, blossoming in grace.